Before we get started in this episode, a quick announcement. As you know, I'm very passionate about acceptance and commitment therapy, and I also run a busy practice in Canberra. We're currently looking for psychologists who are registered in Australia to join our team, who are also passionate about learning about ACT. We provide supervision on a group and individual basis and training around ACT. So if this is you, if you're interested, please express your interest at strategicpsychology.com.au/careers. Look forward to hearing from you. And now back to this episode.
Okay, life can be crazy. You're feeling like you're sinking, just trying to find a meaning. It's time for better thinking. Yeah, better thinking. Time to tune in. Let's go.
Welcome back to Better Thinking. My name's Nesh Nikolic, and today's guest is Dr Celin Gelgec. She is talking to us about her passion of anxiety, in particular obsessive compulsive disorder, but she does work with whether it's social anxiety, generalised anxiety disorder, post-traumatic stress. We really get into some of the methods in which she looks at treating or providing therapy for anxiety, and most interestingly, I think her use of virtual reality in her clinic in Melbourne. I think it's something you're going to really enjoy. I certainly found it very interesting and fascinating, particularly these new advancements in the VR space and the different scenarios that can be used to help clients with exposure and making some more visceral changes by having that visual representation in the therapy room. Hopefully you enjoy this episode as much as I did. Big thank you, Celin, for coming onto the show today.
Thank you so much for having me. It was really lovely receiving the invitation.
Look, I'm really excited to talk to you about this world of anxiety. I think it's a space that a lot of psychologists are interested in, and I've got my own reasons why I like anxiety. I know that there's a few spaces that particularly have a place in your heart, an interest space. Maybe you could just tell us a little bit about, maybe let's start with yourself and your interest in psychology, in anxiety.
Yeah, in terms of how I got into it and ended up working in that area.
Yeah. Why anxiety?
Yeah. Well, I think anxiety is such a huge part of our lives, like it's there as a warning system. It's present for a lot of people almost every day. It serves a function and we can't really escape it as much as we want to. So I think, with that experience of also being human in a sense of in a sense of experiencing something like that, it was really fascinating while studying to go, okay, what is actually going on here and what are the mechanisms behind this, and really trying to understand the nuances of anxiety, and also being really intrigued by anxiety being a universal experience, but how it's still so different for every single person and its footprint is very different for a lot of people. And even though some people might experience similar sorts of symptoms, when we think about different kinds of conditions that exist, whether it's social anxiety or a phobia or generalised anxiety, it's still fascinating that no two people will still be the same. And the other thing that was fascinating for me was recognising how common it is amongst other conditions as well. And so and how much it impacts our behaviour. And so wanting to understand a little bit more about it and learning more about it through placements as a student and all that kind of stuff, I guess, kind of led me down that pathway to keep working with it. And it's a lifelong understanding so far. Well, career long, I guess, but also lifelong for your own self. It's about learning about what your own triggers are and how to manage those and how to deal with them along the way. It's been really fascinating. And there's never been a dull moment either through that process.
Can you talk about how you view anxiety in terms of, what is it? Obviously we use it fairly commonly. I think it gets misused immensely these days.
Yeah.
or we mislabel other feelings as being anxiety. Can you talk a little bit about what is anxiety and what would maybe be the appropriate use of that word as opposed to stress is probably the
that's right.
common one that should be replacing it.
Yeah. So anxiety it can happen in two different ways. We can feel anxiety in our thoughts where, for example, but we can also feel anxiety in our body. And a lot of the time, if we were to really kind of tease it apart, a lot of people talk about stress being something in the mind and anxiety being in the body. So anxiety being more of that physical response that you get, that real, you're feeling it in your body. You might feel sick in your tummy. Your throat might get tight. I'm blending my words. It's probably too early in the morning for me.
I can go with tote. It makes sense to me. Maybe we're a little bit Irish.
Yeah, that's true. Okay, so your throat might feel tight. You might feel tightness in your chest. A lot of people feel like struggle to breathe sometimes, or they get short of breath, or they might feel a bit dizzy or lightheaded, or they might start to heat up a little bit, or they might tense their muscles. There are so many different things that happen in the body when someone feels anxious. But it's really interesting that so many, like what you mentioned, so many other emotions can contribute to anxiety. So, for example, we might be feeling really ashamed about something that we've done, and the way we evaluate that might then start to make us feel really uncomfortable and anxious about that situation. And so we might mislabel it as being anxious when really it's because we're feeling ashamed. And so we can mislabel in that way very much so. And so, like, if you were going through treatment, one of the things that you would want to focus on is labeling it correctly. So recognizing that you're feeling anxious, but that's the end point, then going backwards and going, what led me to that part? Actually, it was because I was feeling ashamed of something, and then I started feeling anxious about it. Or I started feeling uncertain and doubtful about something, and then I was feeling anxious about that. Or I actually started feeling really sad about something, and then that led to anxiety. And so anxiety is almost like a warning sign that something is not quite right. And so when we're feeling emotions that are really uncomfortable, like doubt or guilt or shame, or sometimes disgust even, or if we're feeling sad about something, or frustrated or angry, that can often lead to physical feelings of anxiety, because that's our body's way of recognizing, hey, you're not feeling right, there's something going on here, and almost warning us about that. But then because we're feeling it in our body, we get sidetracked because that takes our attention, and we end up focusing on those physical sensations. And then we start feeling it in our mind as well through our thoughts. We might get lots of anxious thoughts, lots of worry thoughts, lots of stress thoughts, that then kind of perpetuates the cycle as well. So there's so many layers to it, but I think, we can definitely get sidetracked by the physical feelings and sensations and totally miss all the other stuff that's been going on. That's equally important to pay attention to. But I think one of the ways of really learning about anxiety and learning how to manage anxiety is to actually recognize what's triggering it, whether it be an emotion or something else that might be happening, like a situation or a thought, a stress thought that might happen, or something else that might be occurring that's triggering those feelings.
My understanding has been, in trying to summarize what you're saying, is that when we are exposed to something that triggers a response inside us, we would most generally call that a stress response. Because it's our body going into the very functional and adaptive response of saying, I need to do something about this, and there's a threat there which I need to. either, attack, which is that fight response. I need to
that's
run
right.
away, the flight response.
Yeah.
And then post that usually comes the anxiety response, which is kind of thinking about what has happened and continuing to feel that stress response when the stress is no longer there. And it's interesting because there's a functional response there. For example, you and I were walking through a forest and we encountered a snake.
Yeah.
We would immediately get a stress response. But interestingly, even if we then, turned around and started walking in the other direction, we're in safety, for a period of time, we would continue to feel that stress response, which is quite interesting because we're kind of saying the stressor is not there, but we still feel the stress response.
Yeah.
And we kind of call that, within the functional sort of stress, if I can call it that. But it might be that next time I go or even think about going for a bushwalk, I might be at home and I'm worried about tomorrow's event of going for a bushwalk and whether I'll encounter a snake, and I'm starting to get anxious and worried, or I'm worried about my children being in the backyard, that there might be a snake in the backyard, and it's starting to kind of ruminate, worry, and I'm feeling all similar things inside my body, not with the same level of exposure as if the snake was there, versus probably a little bit less if I'm in my living room. But it starts to kind of be there, and that's that kind of loop. It's all very complicated and layered. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a very nice example of that process that I was talking about earlier in terms of providing, okay, so this is what happens, when there's a trigger. Absolutely, exactly like what you said. When we get triggered by something, we start feeling it in our body, we start evaluating it in a certain way. It then influences our behavior. But emotions don't end after the event ends, right? It continues, it lingers, because we have a prefrontal cortex in our brain which keeps those thoughts going because we're evaluating, but then at the same time, based on previous experiences, we're also, our brain's looking for different situations and scenarios where we've been afraid to, and thinking about, oh, this might have, imagine this happened, or what if that happened, or what if it happened like this time at this other thing, or when you watch this documentary and this scary thing happened in terms of the snake. What if that happened? And so our brain likes to catastrophize and go to all sorts of weird and wonderful places, which perpetuates the feelings and the response that you were describing. And then, we start to then think about our present day experience and going, how can I keep protecting myself? Because it's very much a safety mechanism. Its main job is to keep us alive and to make sure that we're still around and all that sort of stuff, in terms of triggering that fight, flight, and freeze response as well, because some people will freeze as well. Like, that's also something that happens to some people. Very much so. It's a really neat example of the function. And I think a lot of people, when they present to treatment and we talk about anxiety in that way, often talk about, but there's nothing actually scary happening, and I think people get caught up in this aspect of something actually scary needs to happen, but it's also how we evaluate things that also can impact on how anxiety can get triggered. And I think in the modern day world, when we're not always exposed to snakes and tigers and other things, thankfully, we forget too that we can feel threatened just by existing in society, in terms of comparing ourselves to other people, which a lot of people can do and fall into the trap of on things like social media and stuff, or like even just our own family environment can be difficult sometimes. Family dynamics, relationship dynamics. There are so many other ways that we can feel threatened in the world. Yeah.
It's interesting because I've noticed, in practice how often, and it's not even necessarily just about anxiety, but quite commonly in the space of anxiety, where clients will come in and they describe something feeling different, and the evaluation of different is that different equals disorder, or different equals wrong, different equals fear. And so we know that usually that's quite protective. For example, if I feel my body and I notice a lump and I go, that's different. There is some value and merit to go and have medical attention to examine that.
That's exactly right. Yeah.
Having said that, if the lump happens to be a small lump on my face and I'm 18 years old, I can probably notice that there's several, probably dozen lumps on my face, and it's not something that is different.
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
So I think this evaluation that you talk about is so important. Otherwise, we get into a space of I'm anxious about being anxious, or I'm kind of I'm relating to my inner skin, my insides, with fear. I'm worried about how I feel.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, very much so.
So, is different something we should be alerted to if I'm having different thoughts or I'm having different
I think
situations?
so. Like, it's kind of a bit of a, like you said, a little bit of a warning, like a red flag maybe, but then putting it into context as you described is really important to then go, okay, I'm feeling this, but what are some other things that are going on? So just being curious about the experience as opposed to getting stuck on just that and running, like sometimes our mind runs away with us like a bullet train and goes to worst case scenarios. And so I think it's about recognizing that process and trying to pull it right back and going, okay, I'm noticing something that feels a little bit different, but what else is going on? What's the context? And it might not be physical, like the example you provided. It might be thought-based. You might be evaluating a conversation that you had with a friend and thinking, oh, did I offend them? Did I say the right thing? Or maybe I should have said this or I should have said that. I think a lot of people can relate to that type of thinking. Or when a friend that regularly text messages you back and doesn't for a little while, and then going, oh, does that mean they don't like me anymore? Have I offended them? Have I done something wrong? Rather than allowing your mind to kind of run away with you, coming back to, well, they usually text me back fairly quickly. Maybe they're busy, maybe they're at work, maybe something's gone on. I'll just keep waiting. Rather than reacting. So just kind of being curious about your experience for a little bit longer and trying to gather more of that evidence before letting that influence your behaviour. Yeah.
So in some sense that initial reaction of, my goodness, I haven't heard from them is a natural and adaptive response, and that could be that whole example of, someone went to the shops, they haven't come back. It's been 10 minutes. Have they had an accident? The classic scenario, or the one that you described. They usually text me back, and we're kind of texting each other a lot, and then haven't heard from them for 20 minutes. What's happened? Did I say something wrong?
Yeah.
And you're saying if we can kind of suspend judgment, not let the mind, not just follow whatever the mind's coming up with, because the mind's a storyteller. It
really
fills in blanks.
Yeah.
It likes to just, complete sentences.
Yeah. And plays on our weaknesses too, in terms of, let me rephrase that. It plays on our vulnerabilities.
Yeah.
It's not, I always have to catch myself using the word weakness. I'm trying to change that. It really plays on our vulnerability in terms of when we're feeling insecure about something or uncomfortable about something. Our mind really likes to pick holes, not pick holes. It really likes to kind of go there and use that as a way to convince us that that's the reason why something is happening. Yeah.
It's interesting because that's kind of exactly what anxiety is. It is looking for survival.
Yes.
which therefore means the opposite is it's looking for threats. And
Yeah.
whether the
right.
threat is, I mean, even us as professionals, we have to kind of always consider what's our language, and weakness is not, the word that we want to use anymore. And fortunately, sometimes we get so caught up in language. At the same time, it's so functionally useful to be accurate. And we go around and around and around, and maybe that's not a bad thing so long as we suspend judgments and examine it and look at it. It's quite fascinating if we were to actually have a recording of all the conversations we have. We would technically be going, my goodness, that's not quite valid and correct. But interestingly, managing that, there's a helpfulness about not reflecting. It's quite interesting, because I know that in our work we're often wanting to do some self-reflection. Yet there's such great value in just accepting those things and focusing on the present rather than going backwards so much.
Yeah. I often say to my clients, sometimes if you've got too much time to think, your brain will think of something for you. And it's never a pretty experience. It's never a fun experience. And everything is good in moderation, and thinking is not that different. And so in a sense of having space for self-reflection is incredibly important. It allows us to grow. But if we spend too much time in self-reflection and reflecting about experiences as well, our mind can go to all sorts of weird and wonderful places, and sometimes really scary places. And it's in those moments recognizing, okay, this actually isn't helping me anymore. There's a helpful thinking and then there's unhelpful thinking. And so if we're heading down unhelpful thinking territory, recognizing what those flags are and being able to bring yourself back to the present moment is incredibly important. And following through with what you want to do, what's important to you, as opposed to what anxiety is telling you to do. I work a lot with people with OCD. So then a lot of people are also competing with with that style of thinking. And so I often say to clients, what's on your agenda as opposed to what's on OCD's agenda, and following through. So it's bringing in those values in terms and using that to inform behavior, as opposed to reacting like we talked about before, and giving into those unhelpful thinking patterns. Otherwise we can get stuck, and ruminate and go around in circles in our thinking. And we can feel like we're doing something because we're thinking about it, but it's not really getting us anywhere. So I think that present moment awareness is really, really important to help break that cycle.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that fascinates me with, this obsessive compulsive experience is how aware people can be about the misalignment of the thoughts.
Yes.
And the feeling. And so there's really an understanding, for example, that if there's a thought which says, I need to turn the light on and off with a multiple of 6 applied to it.
Yes.
And if I don't, something bad is going to happen. And logically, there's a real strong appreciation, understanding that that's not likely to occur. Yeah. Having said that, the misalignment is the internal world, which is that feelings world, responds to that feeling of the snake being in the room if you don't do it for 6 times. So if you do it for 6 times, the snake is not there. If you don't do it for 6 times, then the snake is there. And I think most of us, would step around, walk around, avoid the snake in that sense. But it's hard for someone to reconcile their thoughts and their feelings when they're in conflict. They're not in alignment. It's so fascinating because it's so obvious with OCD, right? It's
absolutely. And clients will often say that. Yeah, one of the things, my cat's come to say hello. One of the things that my clients often say to me is, I know this doesn't make logical sense, but in that moment, I just can't help myself. And because it feels so overwhelming, and it feels real because they're feeling it in their body. They're feeling that response in their body. And so I often say to them, we kind of talk a little bit about what happens in the brain at that moment, and it makes clients feel so empowered because they're like, okay, this is something that's happening to me. It's not something that is that, I'm not broke. It's not because I'm broken or anything like that. So they are able to kind of step away from that evaluation that they're making about them being broken or sick or some other thing that can be really, really self-deprecating, I guess. And so, we talk about this process of, which kind of ties in back to the anxiety process that we were talking about before of, when we're experiencing anxiety and we're really feeling it in our body, there is a function, like the emotion center of our brain, the amygdala, really takes over and sets off this fight, flight, freeze response, but it hijacks the brain completely. And so I talk about how that then shuts down the logic center of our brain, our prefrontal cortex, which also is responsible for things like attention, concentration, decision-making, logical thinking, so reasoning, all of the stuff we would use when we're at work or if we're at school or, just kind of thinking about day-to-day stuff. Our personality kind of sits in there a little bit too. And so when that all gets hijacked and gets shut down, it's like turning that offline. We lose the ability to think rationally and to think clearly and to evaluate more objectively. And so we're acting then purely from an emotional perspective. And I often say that part of our brain will talk to its next door neighbor, which is our hippocampus, which holds our long-term memories. And we'll look for evidence. So we'll go through all our memories and look for evidence of like, what did this person do last time they were in this situation? They kept flicking the light switch, right? And so our amygdala learns through that behavior that this is what I need to do to stay safe. Every time I flick this switch, nothing bad is going to happen. And because we're doing it consistently and repetitively, the brain loves repetition and consistency. It becomes a cycle. And at the same time, we trigger reward pathways in the brain. So then we're like doubly feeling assured that we're doing the right thing. And this process then just continues. And so I often say to my clients, what we need to do is we almost need to retrain and break that. Like we need to break that cycle and retrain the mind and the amygdala to not respond in that way every time this trigger occurs. What we're wanting to do is create a neutral response every time these triggers occur. But what we're doing needs to happen like through exposure therapy, needs to occur consistently and repetitively. And when clients hear that, they often feel so assured that, okay, I physically cannot think about logic in that situation. That actually makes sense. Okay, there's something I can do about this now. What do I need to do to make sure that I'm as present as possible so that my mind's not getting hijacked in that sense? And it can feel really empowering, I think, to kind of work through that process of what is in our control, and then when that choice gets taken away from us, in terms of behavior. Yeah.
Just to use an example so we can somewhat workshop it.
For sure.
Let's just do a hypothetical using the six digit of needing to switch the light on and off. And let's just assume it's the only thing that someone's dealing with. But it's causing them great grief because you and I know that doesn't usually present that way. But what would an exposure approach potentially look like? Because there's so many ways that we could
absolutely
approach that, but let's just maybe talk that through, workshop it a little bit.
Yeah, for sure. So a lot of the time, it's important to be as collaborative as you can with your clinician that's treating you. And so what I often do is discuss with clients first of all, we want to be as specific as possible when it comes to light switches. So sometimes for some people, light switches in the bathroom might be a little bit more triggering than light switches in the lounge room or light switches in their bedroom. Like, there are different associations that are made in different parts of the house for some people. And so firstly, you want to understand, and that's just an example. So firstly, you want to really get a good picture of what is going on in terms of level of difficulty, because one of the first things we want to do when we're doing exposure is establish what we call a hierarchy, which is like a step ladder of degrees of difficulty. And so we want to be able to go, okay, if we're focusing on light switches, what are the different grades of difficulty amongst the light switches? And for some people, there will be grades of difficulty, and for other people, they'll all be the same. So if we're going to keep it really simple, we'll go with, okay, let's just say they're all the same. And if it's multiples of 6, or if it's 6 times that this person is doing it, then one thing we might do is go, okay, how can we break this down a little bit so it feels uncomfortable? Because what we want to do with exposure therapy is trigger a client on purpose, expose them to the thoughts and the feelings that they're experiencing. So that's the exposure part. And then the other part of treatment is called response prevention. So the whole thing is exposure and response prevention. So we trigger, we expose to the thoughts and the feelings, and then we prevent the response. And the response, which is an unhelpful way of coping with the emotions, is a compulsion, and that's flicking the light switches. So if we want to prevent that response, we can't take it away all at once, because our clients have tried that loads of times. And have felt really, really anxious because of it and uncomfortable, and so then give up and feel frustrated because they're like, why can't I stop this? So we go, okay, let's make this a little bit more manageable. So we expose, and then we might go, okay, can we flick the switches 5 times instead of 6? So we might play around with the number of times that it's done. So you're still doing a compulsion.
If I can just quickly jump in. What's interesting is the selection of what we do, because we're able to obviously hierarchically go down from 6 to 5 to 4.
Yes.
But we can just even potentially even question the number altogether, where we say, well, let's go to 6 and add 1. So now we're at 7. We can do anything, right? Or it might be in the speed in which we flick the lights on and off. There's so many variations. This is why I think what you said at the very, very beginning in setting this up is really trying to understand it and be collaborative. And for those, who might be listening, who are experiencing something similar, it's really being curious and trying to understand,
absolutely.
How does this work for me, so I can untangle it. But I'll let you continue, because I did jump in. No, that's okay. You choose 5, you were saying.
Yeah, and there's some of what you've provided are some of the other examples as well, in terms of what we can talk about, what I was going to mention after I finish the example. Absolutely. So really, you can play around with the number. So you can go down in gradual steps. The other thing you can do is you can delay. So this is what we typically do. You can either reduce the number altogether 1 by 1, or you can delay the onset of the compulsion. So, for example, if the feeling kicks in and the trigger is there, or the urge is there, then you can then go, okay, can you wait for a minute or 2 or 5 or however long the client can sit for, or the person can sit for, before flicking the light switch. So really the idea is to sit with discomfort, because the new theory on managing and treating OCD isn't so much about waiting for anxiety to come down anymore. It's really about what we call creating new neural pathways, because we want to inhibit the existing response. And this is through the inhibitory learning model, which is coming out in research recently, as opposed to waiting for habituation, because habituation, which is just the idea of getting used to something, kind of like when you walk into freezing cold water and your body gets used to the temperature, you've habituated to that, and then you can kind of enjoy the water and swim around and all that sort of stuff after freaking out the first time because it's freezing cold. But, you know, typically we used to think, okay, through repeated exposure, people would kind of get used to this idea that actually their feared consequence hasn't occurred, which we still do think, and it still does occur in that way. But what research was noticing was actually not all clients get used to their exposures. Not all clients habituate, and sometimes habituation gets in the way of treatment too. Like clients become preoccupied with waiting for their anxiety to come down, and it's like, why is my anxiety not coming down? And so the inhibitory learning model, it's a bit of a fancy word, but really what that means is doing exposure therapy. So we're still doing ERP, exposure and response prevention. But what we're trying to do is we're trying to do it consistently and repetitively to create new brain pathways to inhibit the old OCD pathways. And what that means is through consistency and repetition of doing the new behavior, it's almost like creating new habits for yourself, but that are helpful and adaptive, as opposed to going down the OCD pathway. And so when you're doing your exposures, whether it's flicking light switches or whatever else it might be, absolutely, there are so many ways you can do it. But what we need to do is make sure that you're doing it consistently and repetitively so that you're creating that new brain pathway to eventually override the old ones or the OCD ones. And so clients will often then go, okay, there's a reason why I need to sit with this discomfort for so long, because it's like being in rehab in a sense when people have to learn to walk and talk again. You know, we need that consistency and repetition to make sure that our brain is doing what we're wanting it to do in that way. So it takes time as well with exposure. Yeah.
The reason why I'm such why I fell in love with the acceptance and commitment therapy is its real understanding and approach with the idea of willingness, you know, the space of, you know, in the service of, let's just call it functionality. We would usually put in a value there, for example, in the service of freedom, or in the service of independence, or in the service of your lifestyle. Would you be willing to sit with discomfort for, 3 minutes before you flick the switch, you know, on and off, you know, several times? You know, there's an understanding that, exposure does, I would probably say, you know, still does probably a large portion of the work. Having said that, if the relationship with exposure for the client changes, which it often does, we then start to evaluate, you know, our feelings and start saying, why is it there? It shouldn't be there. And then we entangle again and we're back in the same space. And I think functionality keeps changing because our mind keeps changing the parameters, the goals, the goalposts, the rigidity, move all the time. You know, models keep coming back in. And so I think there's a real lovely aspect of someone being willing to, you know, partake in and in actual fact accept some pain, some discomfort. Because the truth is, I still find it incredibly uncomfortable getting on an airplane. I find this difficult, you know. Even though I enjoy it so much, my heart raises and all those sorts of things. You know, for the listeners of today's episode, I actually started the intro and I messed it up, and I'm like, all right, stop. Let's do this one again. You know, and that was probably my nerves showing up. So it's a relationship with us. I think that functionality, willingness, and you know, my love of ACT comes from there, really.
And I'm a big fan of it too, and always incorporate it into the work that I do. And the phrase I use with my clients is, you have to be, if you are reluctantly willing to go through with this exposure, that is the sweet spot to be in. And when clients ask, how long will this take? The answer I always give is, it depends on how willing you are to open yourself up to feeling uncomfortable. Because like when we're dealing with OCD, we, in a sense, have learned to a degree, and some of it's biological too, but, there's a large part of learning involved too, where we're kind of sending ourselves this message that I can't cope with these feelings. I can't cope if I don't do X, Y, and Z. And when our family and partners accommodate that behavior as well, even though they're not doing this explicitly, the subtle message of that is, you're looking really distressed right now. I actually don't think you can cope with this, so I'll accommodate this behavior. And so, the other thing that's coming out in research is that we're learning more and more that actually OCD might be more of an emotion dysregulation difficulty as opposed to a thought-based difficulty. And so we typically, like I know in my work, I bring in a lot of ACT-based work and principles in terms of opening up to difficult emotions, opening up to doubt, sitting with uncertainty, leaning into it, and learning more adaptive ways through mindfulness-based techniques to help sit with that discomfort rather than feel like you have to do the compulsion to help you deal with it. So I think it's a really lovely way of incorporating ACT because it's very ERP friendly.
Mm. It maybe gives us a little segue there. Celin, I promised myself that I would ask you a little bit about the VR work that you do, because that's something that I'm interested in. And obviously, as technology improves, I can see there being an incredible opportunity that opens up for all sorts of psychological practices that we can do in virtual reality.
Totally.
Can you tell us about what you're doing in your clinic?
Yeah, so we use virtual reality as part of exposure in a really fun and cool way. So basically, it was the program that we used was developed by psychologists in Spain. And so their platform is purely for anxiety, OCD. There are some things to do with eating disorders on there too. Like, their list is endless. And so we use it basically as another tool to help us do exposure. So a lot of people struggle with imagination because sometimes when we're doing our exposure, we might even break it down if it's too overwhelming to, as a stepping stone, we might use people's imagination to kind of get them started to think about not doing something, or to, if it's a phobia, for example, like they might imagine themselves sitting next to a snake or something like that, or a snake in a cage or whatever else it might be. But not everyone's good with imagination, or sometimes people have worked through all the other types of exposure, like looking at pictures or watching documentaries of snakes or some other thing, and then they might then have to take a trip to the zoo and look at the snake enclosure or something like that, right? Where they're kind of finding it hard to bridge the gap between moving from the therapy room to then doing things in real life. And so if that gap feels too big, we bring virtual reality in to help bridge that gap, because it's a really nice stepping stone between doing things that are in the therapy room that are a lot more removed and then doing something in real life. So even though clients put the goggles on or the headset on and they're like, I know this is fake, but my body is telling me that this is very real. And so they're kind of, again, which is another way of, another form of exposure. And the beauty of it is, and what I really love about it is, I can see on my computer screen what my clients can see in their headset. So I can ask them for feedback in real time. I can coach them through something, or I can teach them a coping strategy and really kind of see what's happening in that moment. So it's a really lovely tool to use to help bridge that gap. And that's how we use it in our clinic as well.
Look, I just can't wait for 20 years to go by or whatever it is, where I can have a client in the room, put on some goggles, I put some goggles on, and we can be, for example, at a party. And I might be someone of their age in their virtual reality, and we can do skill acquisition of having a conversation where they can screw it up, where they can approach me and introduce themselves, where I can go out, ask them awkward questions. We can sit in awkward silences, and doing all of this stuff. Or might be a presentation in a meeting at work, having a difficult conversation with a partner or a family member.
That's right.
It becomes endless because
it means
it
really does
replicate people's lives in safety.
Yes, exactly.
It's going to be a game changer. I think
it really
of how
is.
we do psychology is going
to totally. It's going to be so good. It's
going to be at least a major shift in, and I think also a major shift in clients being able to integrate learnings from therapy into real life. That visceral learning is going to be out of control.
Yeah, because it's so immersive too and triggers all the senses, except for smell maybe, but because it's so triggering and immersive, it's really, really a very strong learning that occurs and really solidifies those neural pathways. And it's like I've often thought similar to you in while using the VR, and there are social situations, like you can have your client sitting in a pub having a conversation, or being at a bar, or sometimes even giving a speech and that kind of stuff. So there's room for all that too. But I've often thought to myself, it would be really much more amazing or immersive if we could do. And I've often thought similar to yourself of going, imagine if I could be there with them, or if this could happen, or if that could happen. And it's just going to be really amazing, especially with this whole metaverse thing that people are talking about now as well.
Yeah, look, I think the possibilities are endless, and it'll certainly change Gestalt work and chair work in a very different way. We don't have to worry about if your mother was sitting in that chair, what would you say to them?
Absolutely.
Incredibly, it has such power.
It's incredible.
In its current form,
really
let alone if we can somehow upload a photo of mum's face and physique and the whole thing, so it looks indistinguishable,
much more realistic.
To reality, photorealistic. It's going to be,
and that's that stepping stone of the imaginary stuff to real life. Like if it feels too scary to have that confronting conversation, to actually then help bridge that gap, but still be safe, because it's still it's not real, but it feels real, and it's because it's so immersive as well. But you've got that level of safety there too. It's going to be wonderful. I'm
looking forward to that time to see, just to see the shift, because psychology in many ways we've benefited so much from science, in the research and understanding our responses better, doing double-blind tests and experiments. There's so much that we've kind of added, but I think this will really move it so far, because we all kind of even things like emotion focused therapy, which is so powerful because it really tries to tap in to our, let's call them our vulnerabilities, our fears, our greatest secrets, our emotions. This will kind of be almost like an easy gateway to enter into those. We're going to need a lot of training, I imagine, in how to do this, because I can see someone like myself, I want to jump in and go to the heart of it straight away. We'll really need to kind of think about how to do this, and plenty of science will need to follow. But I'm so excited, and it's amazing that there's people like yourself that's taking these technologies that have been pioneered in Spain and applying them here. Can I ask you, for our listeners, how can people get in contact with you, find out more about your clinic, the VR work, your interest in obviously anxiety and OCD?
So the clinic that I work at is Melbourne Wellbeing Group, down here in Melbourne, obviously. although not really. Anyway, so melbournewellbeinggroup.com.au is our website. We've got a wonderful team of clinicians who all work with anxiety, and as well as OCD, as well as other conditions. We're very lucky that between all of us, we're kind of spread across the DSM, if that makes sense, in our niche area. But at the same time, because we get a lot of OCD referrals, we've established a reputation for ourselves. All our clients have been working with OCD for a while as well. So they each have their own interest area, but also equally love working with clients with OCD. And everyone also uses VR if it's appropriate to some degree. Not always, but certainly if there's room for it, our clinicians will raise it, and sometimes clients will come and be like, can we use the VR? And so we then incorporate it into the treatment plan if we think it's going to be helpful. So that's where you can find us. We're also on social media like Facebook, Instagram, all that kind of stuff. For clinicians that are interested, if I'm allowed to, I run a lot of workshops on OCD. Which you can link to through my page on the Melbourne Wellbeing Group website, or they can just go to drcelingelgec.com.au and find out some more resources and some more information on anxiety and OCD if they want to. So that's where they can find us.
Fantastic. You'll have to keep me up to date with any advances that come up in that space. I know that it's all very, very in many ways it's quick, but I think the application's slow. It's hard to it's a lot of R&D that needs to go into each of those, and really I'm assuming that these are kind of set scenarios at the moment that are set up, and as that library gets bigger and bigger, it's going to be endless. We've had it for a couple of years, and it's interesting at how much it's changed already. It's already become easier to use, less clunky, but at the same time, the scenarios that are there are really fascinating in terms of what you can toggle as the person who's running the program. Like you can play with time of day. Like if someone's driving, for example, and is worried about going over bridges or driving through heavy traffic, etc., you can make it rain, you can make it day or night, you can put passengers in the car that are annoying the driver, you can do all sorts of things already. So there's a lot of versatility, but it will get even better as the years progress and as the library gets bigger too. Yeah, for sure. And processing power as well. The closer we get it to photorealistic, the more power it has. Absolutely. Yeah. It's going to be like gaming consoles where, I used to have a Sega when I was growing up. Sega Master System. Brilliant. Yes. Brilliant. Yeah, with the little things that used to just press into the little console, and it was like the graphics were awful, but great for their time. I had an Atari, which was even before that. Yes, awesome. I remember those. They were still around a little bit when I was growing up, but like Sega was the thing. But now some of the graphics, like when I watch my nephews play some of their games, and I'm like, is this a movie or something? And they're like, no, we're playing FIFA. And I'm like, oh my God, this looks so realistic. The graphics are just amazing. Yeah. And that's what we have to look forward to, that we'll get to a scenario where the computing power's there, the R&D. Obviously, these games are, some of these gaming companies are multi-billion-dollar companies. Absolutely. I think medicine, psychology, the world of health, will invest over time and make something pretty special. So it'll be amazing. Fantastic. Well, Celin, I know that you're busy. We could talk for many more hours on this. Do keep us updated, and really appreciate your time and opening up our eyes to those different aspects of anxiety and the OCD world, and in particular VR as well. So I appreciate your time today. You're very welcome. Thank you so much for your time also. And I hope the listeners can take away some little gold nuggets from this podcast today. They most certainly will. Thanks again. Yeah. Thank you so much. If you enjoyed this podcast, please support it by going to iTunes and putting a review, subscribe, share it via social media, and tell others about it. Start a conversation. It's listeners like you that make this able and possible, and why we bring in these guests to go out and share their knowledge and resources. And just lastly, if you are a psychologist and you want to go out and be part of a bigger team, develop your experience and get into some exciting work, come to strategicpsychology.com.au/careers and reach out. I'd love to hear from you.